Sarah had lived in her quiet suburban neighborhood for years. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where lawns were always neatly trimmed, kids played in the streets until dusk, and the sound of lawnmowers and weekend barbecues filled the air. Nothing much ever happened there, and that's the way Sarah liked it. So when the old house next door went up for sale, it caused quite a stir. The property had been vacant for months after the elderly owner passed away, and the neighborhood had been buzzing with speculation about who might move in. One Saturday morning, a moving truck pulled up, and Sarah watched from her living room window as a man in his late 30s stepped out. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious expression, wearing all black. He didn't wave or introduce himself to anyone, just disappeared into the house. From that moment on, something about the man unsettled Sarah. He never seemed to leave his house during the day, and when she did see him, it was only late at night. The lights in his house stayed off most of the time, except for a faint glow from a back window that she could see from her upstairs bedroom. Even the way he moved was strange, quiet, almost gliding across his yard, never making eye contact with anyone. The first week she shrugged it off as him just being a private person, but things began to get stranger. It started with noises. Late at night, when Sarah was lying in bed, she'd hear something coming from next door, a low, rhythmic scraping sound like furniture being dragged across the floor. It would go on for hours, long past midnight. She tried to ignore it at first, thinking maybe her new neighbor was just moving things around or remodeling. But the sound didn't stop. Every night, like clockwork, the scraping would begin around 2 a.m. and last until dawn. One evening, Sarah decided to approach him. She'd bake some cookies, use the gesture as a neighborly excuse to break the ice and figure out what was going on. She carried the plate over, rehearsing in her head how she'd ask him about the strange noises without sounding like a paranoid busybody. She rang the doorbell and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, but only a sliver. The man stood in the shadows, his face half hidden behind the door. "Yes?" His voice was flat, devoid of warmth or emotion. "Hi, I'm Sarah from next door," she began, forcing a smile. "I just wanted to bring these over as a welcome. You know, since you're new to the neighborhood." She held out the plate of cookies. He stared at her, his dark eyes unblinking as if the gesture was completely foreign to him. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he reached out, took the plate without a word, and closed the door in her face. Sarah stood there, stunned. No, thank you, no small talk, just a cold silence. The interaction left her with an uneasy feeling, and as she walked back to her house, she glanced over her shoulder at his window. The faint light in the back of the house was glowing again, flickering like an old, dying bulb. That night, the scraping sound returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent, like something was being dragged across the floor with force. Sarah tossed and turned in her bed, her frustration building. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was happening next door. At 2:30 a.m., Sarah grabbed a flashlight, threw on a jacket, and stepped out into her backyard. The night was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic scraping that seemed to vibrate through the cool air. She crept along the edge of her yard, peering through the fence that separated her house from the neighbors. The light from his back window was flickering wildly now, casting long, erratic shadows across the ground. Holding her breath, Sarah approached the side of his house, careful to stay hidden. She crouched down near the basement window, which was slightly cracked open. The scraping was louder here, echoing from deep within the house. As she leaned closer, trying to get a better listen, a low voice joined the sound. It was faint, like someone whispering, but too distorted for her to make out the words. Her skin prickled with fear. She knew she should go back to her house, lock the doors, and forget this ever happened. But something compelled her to stay. Suddenly, the whispering stopped and the scraping ceased. The silence was suffocating. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched there, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then the window creaked open wider. A pale hand reached out, gripping the window's edge from the inside. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hand was thin, almost skeletal, the skin stretched tight over bony fingers. It gripped the window frame as if testing its strength. Slowly, the hand pulled back, disappearing into the darkness below. Sarah bolted. She stumbled back toward her house, adrenaline surging through her body. She fumbled with the back door, her hands shaking as she shoved it open and slammed it behind her. Leaning against the door, she tried to catch her breath, her mind racing with what she had just seen. That night, the scraping continued, louder than ever, reverberating through the walls of her house. The next morning, Sarah called the police. She reported the noises, the strange behavior of her neighbor, and the unsettling things she had seen. 2 officers arrived within the hour and went next door to investigate. Sarah watched nervously from her window as they knocked on the door. After a few minutes, the door opened and the neighbor stepped out. They spoke briefly before the officers entered his house. What felt like an eternity passed, and when the officers finally emerged, their faces were grim. They exchanged a few more words with the man who stood silently by the door, his expression as unreadable as ever. Then they left, without so much as a glance toward Sarah's house. That evening, there was a knock on Sarah's door. It was one of the officers who had investigated her complaint. He told her there was nothing suspicious inside the neighbor's house, no evidence of anything unusual. The noises, he said, were likely due to the old structure settling or perhaps renovations. "But the hand," Sarah blurted out. "I saw something in his basement." The officer looked at her, his expression softening. "Ma'am, there was no basement. The house doesn't have one." Sarah's blood ran cold. She closed the door, her mind spinning. No basement. But she had seen it, heard the sounds coming from it. How could that be possible? That night, Sarah lay in bed, her heart pounding as the familiar scraping sound began again. But this time it was different. It wasn't coming from next door. It was coming from beneath her own floorboards. As the noise grew louder, Sarah's eyes widened in terror. She gripped the sides of her bed, her breath catching in her throat. And then, from the darkness of her bedroom, she heard it, a faint, distorted whisper. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to see more of our content, please hit the subscribe button.